Hey guys, tonight we are diving deep, and I mean really deep, into a job that makes your worst day at the office look like a paid vacation to a five-star resort. We're heading back to the 14th century, a time when Europe was, shall we say, not at its best. Picture this. You're walking through a medieval street. The air isn't exactly fragrant, a charming mix of mud waste and a peculiar metallic tang you can't quite place. Let's just say it wasn't Chanel number 5. It's eerily quiet. Silence. Then you hear the slow, ominous creak of cartwheels approaching, the mournful clang of a bell, and then the whisper that chills you to your very core, "Bring out your dead." Congratulations. It's body collection day again. And honestly, in this world, you probably won't survive this one long enough to see next Tuesday. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. I'd love to see where you're tuning in from and what time it is in your corner of the world, so drop that in the comments below. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The silence of this 14th century European street isn't the peaceful kind. It's a heavy, watchful quiet, the kind that presses in on your eardrums. You find yourself noticing the smallest sounds, the drip, drip, drip from a cracked gutter overhead, the furtive skittering of something small and unseen in the shadowed alleyway to your left, a single dry cough echoing from a boarded-up window across the narrow lane. The sun, if it's out at all, struggles to pierce the oppressive gloom between the leaning timber-framed houses, their upper stories almost touching, creating a perpetual twilight below. You tread carefully on the uneven cobblestones, slick with, well, you try not to think too much about what makes them slick. Everywhere you look, there are signs, not the cheerful kind pointing to the local bakery or tavern. These are crude, chalked symbols on heavy oak doors, sometimes a cross, sometimes just a stark, forbidding line. Windows are shuttered tight, not against bad weather, but against something far more insidious that has already claimed the occupants, or is in the terrifying process of doing so. The air, as we've established, is a cocktail of unpleasantness, but beneath the usual medieval miasma of unwashed bodies, animal dung, and rotting refuse, there's a cloying sweetness, a sickly perfume that hints at herbs and spices failing to mask a deeper, more persistent odor of decay. Optimism is in pretty short supply here, much like reliable plumbing and 5-second rules for dropped food. Then that sound you're already dreading intensifies. The slow, rhythmic creak, groan, creak, groan of overloaded wooden wheels on stone, a sound that seems to suck all other noise into itself. It's accompanied by the clang of a handbell, not rung with any particular urgency, but with a monotonous, deadening regularity. And the voice, hollow and tired, repeats its dreadful litany, moving from house to house, street to silent street. Bring out your dead. There's no emotion in it, no pity, no fear, just a weary resignation. It's a sound that signifies the end of hope for some and a grim daily reality for everyone. Imagine hearing that, knowing that behind one of those doors, it could be your family, your friends, or soon yourself. This isn't an abstract fear. This is the world you now inhabit. Death is no longer a distant event, a somber ceremony for the aged or the tragically unfortunate. Here, in the grip of what they called the great pestilence, death is a constant companion, a shadow that looms over every interaction, every meal, every breath you take. We know it today as the Black Death, a pandemic that ravaged Europe. peaking with devastating intensity between 1347 and 1351. In some regions, it's estimated that up to half the population perished. Think about that for a moment. Every second person you know gone. Entire villages wiped out, cities decimated. The sheer scale of it is almost impossible to comprehend, a relentless tide of mortality that reshaped society from the ground up. People, understandably, were terrified and confused. They didn't understand germ theory. The concept of microscopic organisms causing disease was centuries away. The prevailing belief was often in miasma or bad air. They thought the plague was carried on foul-smelling winds emanating from swamps or even from the alignment of the planets. This led to some rather creative preventative measures. One quirky tidbit from the time is the image of people clutching bunches of sweet-smelling herbs like posies to their noses, believing the fragrant barrier would ward off the noxious plague-carrying air. You've probably heard the nursery rhyme, "Ring a roses, a pocket full of posies, a tissue, we all fall down." Many believe its origins lie in this grim period, the roses referring to the rash, the posies to the herbs, and all fall down. Well, that part's pretty self-explanatory. They thought bad smells carried the plague. So naturally, the solution was more smells, just, prettier ones. Spoiler, it didn't work, but points for effort, I guess. Incense was burned. Vinegar was used to wash floors and bodies, anything to combat the invisible threat. Historians still argue whether the Great Pestilence, as it was then known, was solely bubonic plague, caused by the bacterium Yersinia pestis, and spread by fleas on rats, or if it was a more complex cocktail of horrors. Were there strains of pneumonic plague spreading directly from person to person through coughs and sneezes, or even septicemic plague where the infection overwhelmed the bloodstream with terrifying speed? The truth is, the descriptions from the period are vivid, but often lack the precise clinical detail we'd use today, leading to ongoing scholarly debate about the full nature and range of the diseases that cause such widespread devastation. And amidst all this chaos, fear, and overwhelming loss, there was a job. A job so vile, so dangerous, so utterly thankless, that it fell to the truly desperate, the condemned, or those with literally no other choice. As that cart rumbles closer, and the crier's voice echoes in the suffocating silence, you realize that someone has to guide that cart. Someone has to lift those bodies. Someone has to face the plague in its most concentrated form day in and day out. That someone is the body collector, the death crier, the person who became the living embodiment of the end. This is the job you wouldn't wish on your worst enemy, yet it was a grim necessity in a world turned upside down by death. And it's into their worn-out shoes we're about to step. Those worn-out shoes are now yours. The thin leather, stiff with age, and something you'd rather not identify, offers little comfort against the cold, damp stones beneath your feet. As the last echoes of "Bring Out Your Dead" fade from the previous street, you take a breath. A shallow one, always shallow now, and prepare to begin your own grim recital. This isn't a role you auditioned for. It's a sentence handed down by circumstance, by a world that is fundamentally broken. You are now the collector, the one tasked with walking towards the very thing everyone else flees from. You are, in the starkest terms, a dead man walking, and every soul you pass, every shuttered window you approach, seems to understand this, even if they don't dare meet your gaze. This job, if you can even call it, that is defined entirely by death. It's a constant, overwhelming immersion in its sights, its sounds, and most unforgettably, its smells. The sweet, cloying odor of decay we touched upon earlier. That's now your constant companion, a perfume that clings to your clothes, your hair, your very skin, no matter how vigorously you might try to scrub it away later, assuming you even have the strength or the means for such a luxury. You'll approach doors marked with that dreaded red or white cross symbols that scream, "Danger, stay away." And you'll be the one to knock to call out to wait for the heartbreaking task of receiving what's left of a family. Sometimes a survivor, hollow-eyed and moving like a ghost, will motion you towards a shrouded form. Other times there's only silence, and you'll have to push open that door yourself, stepping into a space where life has been brutally extinguished. Let's be brutally honest about your prospects in this new career. Your life expectancy has just taken a nosedive that would make a daredevil blush. We know today that mortality rates for those who contracted the various forms of the plague during that era were staggeringly high. For the pneumonic form, which spread through the air, or the septicemic, which invaded the bloodstream, it was near enough to a 100% fatality rate. Bubonic plague, the most common form, identified by the telltale swollen lymph nodes called buboes, still killed a horrifying majority of its victims, perhaps as many as 3 out of every 4, especially without the kind of medical intervention that simply didn't exist then. And you're wading into the thick of it, handling infected bodies, breathing the air in infected homes. Your new career didn't exactly come with a 5-year plan, more like a 5-day plan, if you were lucky, or particularly good at holding your breath. Though that's not a medically sound prevention strategy, unfortunately. Every cough you hear from a fellow collector, every slight fever you feel in your own body, becomes a terrifying question mark. So, who are you really? Who would willingly sign up for this? The job interview was probably pretty short. Can you lift things? Are you still breathing? Your hired uniform's on the... Well, find something that still has some fabric on it. In truth, the volunteers for this task were rarely volunteering in the way we understand it. They were often drawn from the lowest rungs of society, the desperately poor, who had no other means to even attempt to feed themselves, or their starving families. Prisoners offered a grim chance at freedom if they survived a season of collection, or individuals who were already marginalized and had little left to lose. Some historical accounts, particularly from Italy, where collectors were known as bikini, fin, or from Persian regions, suggest a complex and often grim picture. Occasionally, these collectors were granted certain morbid privileges out of sheer necessity, like being permitted to take some of the belongings of the dead as a form of payment. A practice that, while perhaps understandable in a world gone mad, also made them figures of even greater fear and suspicion, often accused of looting and profiting from misery. It's a chilling thought, being given the perk of sifting through the remnants of a life abruptly ended. Your beat isn't just one street, one small parish. You're roaming through entire districts, sometimes even dispatched to outlying hamlets and villages where the sickness has flared up and no local infrastructure remains to cope. You become a familiar, unwelcome sight, a mobile monument to the world's suffering. Historians still debate the precise level of societal breakdown versus organized response in different localities when it came to corpse disposal. In some places, it seems a desperate fragile order was maintained with designated collectors and burial teams operating under some kind of municipal or religious authority. In others, panic and the sheer volume of death led to a near total collapse of social structures, with bodies left in the streets or hastily disposed of by terrified survivors. Regardless of the level of organization, your presence is rarely a comfort. People didn't exactly roll out the welcome mat when they saw you and your cart approaching. More like they rolled up the carpets, boarded the windows a little tighter, and possibly threw some holy water in your general direction just in case. The silence that greets you is thick with fear, grief, and an unspoken prayer that you'll pass their door by just for today. But the cart always stops, the bell always tolls, and the dead always need collecting. And you, with your heavy heart and an even heavier burden on your back, are the one to do it. Each day is a repeat of the last, a slow trudge through a landscape of sorrow, each collected body a testament to the plague's relentless march and a stark reminder of your own dwindling chances. So there you are, standing beside your primary implement of this sorrowful trade. Let's take a moment to appreciate your equipment, shall we? It's not exactly the cutting edge of 14th century technology. In fact, it's probably seen better decades, if not centuries. You have your cart, your bell, and a piece of cloth that looks like it's been through several apocalypses already. This is your toolkit for navigating a world steeped in death. A sparse collection of items that offer about as much protection as a paper umbrella in a hurricane. You run a hand over the rough, splintered wood of the cart's side, feel the cold, unyielding metal of the bell, and glance at the stained, limp fabric with a sigh that seems to carry the weight of every body you've ever collected. First, the cart. This cart isn't winning any design awards, that's for sure. Its main features are wood, wheels mostly round, and an uncanny ability to carry slightly more than you can comfortably manage on your own, especially when laden with the departed. It's a rickety, high-sided wooden affair, probably cobbled together from whatever timber was available, perhaps repurposed from a farmer's dray or a merchant's wagon that no longer had a merchant to drive it. The wheels groan and squeak with every rotation, a mournful symphony that announces your approach long before the bell does. Pulling it, or sometimes pushing it, if the incline is particularly cruel, is a full-body workout you never signed up for. The wood is stained with, well, let's just call it history. It's absorbed the grief and the grim reality of its purpose. Each jolt on the uneven cobbles sends a shudder through its frame and up your arms, a constant reminder of the fragile, heavy burdens it's designed to bear. Maintenance plan. If it breaks, you find more wood. Or perhaps you just drag it until it disintegrates entirely. It's less a vehicle and more a mobile, open-topped coffin, a constant companion in your daily dance with death. Then there's the bell. It might be brass or bronze green with verdigris, its surface worn smooth in places from countless hands that have wrung it before yours. It's heavy, and the clapper inside strikes with a dull, resonant clang that cuts through the oppressive silence of plague-stricken streets. Its purpose is twofold: a warning for the living to clear the way, to shutter their windows, and perhaps offer a prayer and an announcement to those households touched by the sickness that their time for releasing their dead has come. There's no cheer in its sound, no call to joy, like church bells on a Sunday morning, or how they used to be anyway. This bell is a somber punctuation mark in a narrative of loss. Holding it, ringing it hour after hour, you feel the vibrations travel up your arm, a physical manifestation of the sorrow you herald. It's a lonely sound, isolating you even as it makes your presence known to all. And finally, the cloth. Ah, the infamous filthy cloth. It's probably a rectangle of coarse linen or wool stained with unidentifiable substances, worn thin in patches and smelling faintly of damp decay, and perhaps a lingering hint of the vinegar it might have been doused in a futile attempt at purification. Not exactly a hazmat suit, is it? More like a very sad, very dirty tea towel that's seen far too much. Its protective qualities are roughly equivalent to wishful thinking. What's it for? You might use it to cover the faces of the dead, a small, inadequate gesture of respect in a world that has little to offer. Or perhaps you use it to try and get a better grip. When lifting a body, the fabric, a thin barrier between your skin and the chilling reality of what you're handling. Maybe you even hold it over your own nose and mouth, sometimes a desperate instinctual act, even if you don't truly understand why. You see, the concept of germs, of tiny invisible organisms, causing such widespread devastation simply doesn't exist in your 14th century understanding. The learned doctors of the time, those who hadn't already fled or succumbed themselves, spoke of an imbalance in the body's humors. Blood phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. According to the prevailing medical theories inherited from ancient thinkers, like Galen's sickness, arose when these humors were out of whack. Or as we mentioned, it was the miasma, the bad air, the noxious fumes rising from the earth, or sent by unfavorable celestial alignments. So your primary defense is against a bad smell. You might be encouraged to burn fragrant herbs, or, as we saw, carry posies. But this cloth, it offers no real protection against the corpse air you're constantly breathing, laden with who knows what from the recently deceased. They didn't know about germs, bless them. If you'd tried to explain tiny invisible beasties causing all this, they'd have probably offered you a nice calming cup of, well, probably plague water, given the state of things. It's interesting to note that later plagues, particularly in the 17th century, saw the emergence of the rather iconic plague doctor costume, with its long coat gloves, and that famous bird-like mask with a beak stuffed with aromatic herbs. The idea was that the herbs would filter out the miasma. While visually terrifying, and a symbol of plague, times this kind of specialized, though still ultimately ineffective against germs, attire wasn't typically available to the humble body collector during the Black Death. You got the cart, the bell, and the sad, filthy cloth. That was your lot. Historians still debate the extent to which specific clothing or items used by those handling the dead were believed to offer magical or symbolic protection versus purely practical, if inadequate, use. Was a certain type of wood in the cart considered luckier? Did the way you tied a knot in the cloth hold some deeper warding significance? Probably not. But in a world so overwhelmed by an invisible enemy, people will cling to any semblance of control, any ritual, however small. For you, though, these tools are just what they are: basic, crude, and utterly insufficient for the monumental, lethal task at hand. They are tools of misery, each one, a reminder of your proximity to death and the utter lack of understanding of the foe you face every single day. With your meager tools in hand, or rather attached to your aching limbs, the day begins. Or perhaps begins is too optimistic a word. It simply continues. Your morning commute is a bit different from most. No traffic jams unless you count the existential dread that seems to clog every narrow alleyway. And your main objective for the day is to well collect the previous night's deliveries. There's no cheerful greeting from colleagues, no bustling marketplace to pass through. Just the cold gray light of dawn filtering down, promising another stretch of hours, identical in their grim purpose to the ones before. You probably didn't sleep much. Sleep offers little escape when the waking world is a nightmare and the sounds of your own coughing or the scuttling in the walls are constant reminders of the peril you're in. You set out on your route, the rickety cart protesting, with its usual symphony of groans and creaks, the bell in your hand, feeling heavier than it did yesterday, if that's even possible. The streets are unnervingly silent. This isn't the quiet of a sleeping town. It's the quiet of an emptied one. You trudge through these desolate lanes, your footsteps and the cart's noisy progress echoing unnaturally in the stillness. Where once there was the chatter of merchants, the laughter of children, the clang of a blacksmith's hammer, now there are only whispers. Sometimes you hear them quite literally, a hushed murmur from behind a tightly barred door as you pass a stifled sob, a prayer hastily uttered. More often, the whispers are figurative, the silent screams of houses where entire families have been extinguished, the ghostly rustle of leaves in an untended garden, the wind whistling through a broken pane of glass like a mournful sigh. You become acutely aware of details you'd never have noticed before. The way the grass has begun to push its way up between the cobblestones in the market square. The doors that hang slightly askew on their hinges. The chilling absence of birdsong. It's as if the world itself is holding its breath, waiting for the pestilence to pass or for everything to finally succumb. Your first stop and every stop after follows a grimly familiar pattern. You bring the cart to a halt, the wheels scraping against the uneven ground. You raise the bell, its cold metal a familiar weight, and send its somber call into the quiet air. Bring out your dead. Then you wait. Sometimes the door creaks open, almost immediately, revealing a gaunt figure, eyes wide with a mixture of grief and fear, who gestures mutely towards a shrouded bundle on the threshold. There are no words exchanged. What is there to say? You avert your gaze, a small, perhaps pointless gesture of respect, and then comes the heavy lifting. The bodies are often stiff, awkward, and heavier than you'd think. You try to be gentle, but efficiency is key. There are many more stops to make. Other times, there's no response. After calling out a few times, you're faced with the dreaded task of entering yourself, pushing open a door that hasn't been open for days, stepping into the dim, stale air of a home where the plague has run its course is an experience that chills you to the bone no matter how many times you endure it. The sheer number of dead is often staggering. It's a grim harvest, and it seems to grow more plentiful each day. Historically, cities like Florence and London recorded daily death tolls in the hundreds, sometimes even thousands, at the peak of the Black Death. Church graveyards, the traditional resting places, were overwhelmed in weeks, sometimes days, forcing the living to find other, more desperate solutions for the ever-increasing tide of mortality. As you make your rounds, the cart, your constant creaking companion, becomes more than just a tool. It transforms into a symbol, a harbinger of doom. The sound of its wheels, the clang of your bell. These are the auditory cues that death is at your elbow, that the collector is near. You're not exactly winning any Neighbor of the Year awards. When people see you coming, it's less, "Oh, good, the service is here," and more of a quick bolt, the door douse, the lights pretend, "We're not home," or "alive." Children, if any are still brave enough to peek from behind curtains, might point with a mixture of terror and morbid fascination. Adults shrink away, sometimes making signs to ward off evil, their faces pale. You are the embodiment of their greatest fear, a constant mobile reminder of the fragility of life. It doesn't matter that your work is essential, that without you, and those like you, the streets would become even more nightmarish. You are tainted by your association with the dead, a necessary evil. And the loneliness of that role is a heavy burden to carry, almost as heavy as the bodies in your cart. And so the day grinds on a soul-crushing monotony of horror. Each street, each house presents a slight variation on the same theme of loss and decay. It's like Groundhog Day, but with more corpses and significantly worse sanitation. You probably don't even need a to-do list anymore. The route is seared into your memory, as is the sequence of actions. Quirky as it may sound, in some more organized communities, officials desperately tried to impose regulations on this process. Rules about how deep graves should be dug, when there was still space for graves, or how bodies should be wrapped if materials were even available. Sometimes collections were restricted to night hours to minimize public panic, but often the scale of death made such rules impossible to enforce. And who was counting truly? Historians still debate how consistently and by whom the count of the dead was kept during the Black Death, making precise overall mortality figures for specific regions a subject of ongoing research and sometimes grim recalculation. For you, the collector, the numbers are just an endless stream. The repetition doesn't dull the senses. If anything, it sharpens the awareness of your own precarious position. Each body lifted is a gamble. Each infected house entered a spin of a terrible roulette wheel. The whispers and wheels are the soundtrack to your existence, an existence teetering on the very edge of the abyss. Each breath you take feels like a gamble. The air in these plague-stricken streets, in these silent shuttered houses, isn't just heavy with the scent of decay and despair. It feels actively hostile. You remember the physicians, or what's left of them, talking about miasma, the corrupted air that supposedly carries the sickness. While their understanding of the mechanism was off, their instinct that the very environment was dangerous was tragically accurate. You try to breathe shallowly to turn your head away when handling the deceased, but it's a futile gesture. Your job requires you to be intimately close with the source of the contagion, to immerse yourself in the atmosphere of death. There's no pristine laboratory, no protective gear beyond that sad, filthy cloth we talked about. You're breathing it all in every moment of your working day. The risks are not just in the air, though. Every surface you touch, every shrouded form you lift, is a potential source of your own demise. The bacterium we now know as Yersinia pestis was an incredibly versatile and insidious killer, capable of spreading in multiple ways. You might brush against clothing still harboring infected fleas, the tiny vectors that jumped from rats to humans carrying the plague in their bites. This often led to the dreaded bubonic form, with those painful swollen lymph nodes, the buboes, appearing in the groin armpits or neck. Or perhaps you're in a room where someone died coughing their lungs, riddled with the pneumonic form of the plague. In that case, the very air is thick with invisible infectious droplets, and just breathing them in could seal your fate even more rapidly. And then there's the direct contact with infected tissues or fluids. A small cut on your hand, something you wouldn't even notice on a normal day, could become an open doorway for the pestilence. Your personal hygiene routine probably consists of hoping for a strong gust of wind to blow the worst of it away. Hand sanitizer is still about 500 years away from being invented, so that's off the table. You are quite simply a magnet for infection, a walking bullseye in a world overrun by microscopic archers. So what happens when that gamble doesn't pay off? What happens when you feel the first telltale sign that your luck has finally run out? Perhaps it starts with a sudden chill, a shivering that has nothing to do with the damp air. Or maybe it's a headache that splits your skull, a wave of nausea that doubles you over. That little tickle in your throat you've been ignoring. Probably just a bit of dust from that last hovel. Or you know the microscopic harbinger of your imminent demise. Try not to overthink it as you hoist another body onto the creaking cart. Soon, though, the symptoms become undeniable. A burning fever takes hold, making your teeth chatter and your skin feel like it's on fire. And then, perhaps you feel it. A tender swelling lump in your groin or under your arm. The bubo. The mark of the plague. There's no cure, no medicine that will turn the tide. The local barber surgeon might offer to lance the swelling, a painful and usually pointless procedure, or they might prescribe some foul-tasting herbal concoction that does nothing but empty your coin purse, if you even have one. You know what this means. You've seen it hundreds of times. You are now one of them. Living with this constant looming threat takes an unimaginable psychological toll. Every morning you wake up, if you manage to wake up, you might do a quick, fearful inventory of your own body. Any new aches, any unusual warmth. The paranoia can be as corrosive as the disease itself. It's a quirky and rather sad tidbit from the era that some people believed strong emotions like intense fear or profound grief could actually make a person more susceptible to the plague. Others thought that even staring too intently at a sick person or being looked at by them could transmit the illness through the eyes, a kind of evil eye of contagion. So the very fear the plague instilled was in a way feared as another pathway to sickness. Imagine carrying that burden, not only facing the physical risk, but also the terror that your own understandable fear might be betraying you. Your interactions, if you have any, become strained. Do you dare get close to anyone, even if it's just another collector sharing your grim fate? Or do you isolate yourself, waiting for the inevitable in solitary misery? This is your existence, a constant, exhausting dance with death. You sway and dip, trying to avoid its grasp, but the music never stops, and your partner is relentless. Historians and epidemiologists continue to discuss the relative importance of rat flea transmission versus direct human-to-human transmission, especially for pneumonic plague, in driving the sheer speed and terrifying spread of the Black Death through different environments. Crowded cities versus rural areas, for example. But for you on the ground, these academic distinctions matter little. The threat is everywhere, multifaceted and inescapable. Your main coping mechanism might be a sort of gallows humor shared with any fellow collectors still standing, a brief bitter laugh in the face of overwhelming odds. Or perhaps it's just a profound, weary sigh that says, well, this is my life now, for the next few days anyway. And yet, despite knowing that with every breath, with every body you collect, you are stepping closer to joining them, the work continues. Because someone has to do it. The living, however, few still need the dead to be taken away. And so you keep breathing, keep walking, keep collecting, locked in infections, slow fatal embrace, until the music finally fades for you too. It's not just the constant risk of infection that weighs you down heavy as the corpses in your cart. It's the crushing weight of what you've become in the eyes of the living. You are an outcast, a pariah, a walking, breathing symbol of of the pestilence itself. Even if, by some miracle, you remain untouched by the physical sickness for a while longer, you are already deeply infected by the fear and revulsion that radiates from everyone you encounter. An invisible wall has sprung up between you and the rest of humanity, a barrier more potent than any locked door or shuttered window. You are on one side, the side of death and decay, and they, the dwindling few, are on the other, clinging desperately to life and shunning anything that reminds them of its fragility, which unfortunately is now you. You feel it in the way eyes slide away from yours the moment they register your presence, as if even looking at you might be a form of contamination. Doors that were perhaps ajar will slam shut with a sudden, violent finality as you approach. Children, who once might have stared with morbid curiosity, are now snatched back by frantic parents, their faces pale with a terror that stings more than any overt aggression. Your social life isn't exactly buzzing. People tend to give you a wide berth. Like other side of the continent, wide. You make telemarketers look popular. Sometimes it's not silent avoidance. You might hear a muttered curse, a "God save us," whispered, with more fear than piety, or even have refuse thrown in your general direction from an upper window by someone too scared to confront you directly, but desperate to express their loathing. You are a necessary evil, a function that must be performed, but the necessity doesn't translate into acceptance, let alone gratitude. You are simply the filth collector, and the filth in their minds has rubbed off on you irrevocably. This treatment is chillingly similar to how society has always treated lepers, with a profound isolating fear. You wear an invisible leper's cloak woven from the dread of others. During plague outbreaks, it was common for special laws and social customs to spring up, all aimed at isolating the sick and anyone associated with them. Houses where the plague had struck were often marked with a painted cross or a bundle of straw, a clear sign to all to stay away. Sometimes guards were posted to ensure no one entered or left, turning homes into prisons for the dying. By extension, you, the one who services these marked houses, become marked yourself. It's a quirky and rather grim tidbit that some historical accounts suggest body collectors, or death criers as they were sometimes called, were occasionally forced to wear specific identifiable clothing, perhaps a particular dark color or a certain rough fabric, that immediately signaled their grim profession and their unclean status to everyone. This wasn't about a uniform for ease of identification in a professional sense. It was about branding. Sometimes, the bell you ring wasn't just to announce the death cart, but to warn people of your approach even when you were off duty, a constant auditory reminder to keep their distance. Think of it as a 14th century social distancing measure, but amplified by layers of superstition and abject terror. You're not just seen as someone doing an unpleasant job. You're viewed as a harbinger of death itself, death's personal messenger. The sight of you, the sound of your cart and bell, doesn't just mean that someone has died. To many, it feels like an omen that more death will follow. You've become the human equivalent of a black cat crossing someone's path if the cat also drove a rattling cart of doom and smelled faintly of, well, you know. Party invitations are probably thin on the ground, assuming parties are even still a thing. This psychological burden, the knowledge that your very presence invokes such profound dread, is a heavy one to bear. You are a constant reminder of mortality, a specter at a feast that has long since grown cold. Even those who might in a more rational moment understand the necessity of your work will likely still feel that primal urge to recoil, to protect themselves and their loved ones from the aura of death that clings to you like a shroud. And what of your own end? When the fever finally takes you, when the buboes erupt, or when your lungs fill, and each breath becomes a ragged agony, what then? There will be no gentle hands to soothe your brow, no tearful family to mourn your passing, no priest to offer last rites with any semblance of dignity. You are already considered unclean, contaminated beyond redemption. Your body will simply be added to the cart, perhaps by a fellow collector who looks at you with a grim understanding, knowing their own turn is likely next. There will be no marked grave, no prayers sung over your remains. Your final resting place, as we'll explore soon, will almost certainly be a communal pit, an anonymous hole in the ground, where the unclean dead are unceremoniously dumped. Looking for a promotion in this line of work? Unlikely. Your career path has a pretty abrupt and undignified end. No gold watch for retirement, more like a communal ditch if you're lucky enough to even make it that far. Historians debate the degree to which the extreme social ostracism of plague workers was universal across all regions and social strata, or if some communities, out of sheer desperation, or perhaps a different deeply buried ethical framework, showed more complex attitudes. Were there isolated pockets of grudging respect, a flicker of compassion, or was it a near universal tide of fear and loathing? For you trudging these desolate streets, the answer feels starkly, painfully clear. You are the lowest of the low feared in life and forgotten in death. You felt the grit of the ill-fitting shoes, the splintered wood of the cart, the chill of the bell. You've breathed the air thick with unseen dangers and felt the icy dread of society's collective gaze upon you. The question that hangs heavy in the silence of these plague-ravaged streets, a question you've probably asked yourself 1,000 times in the dead of night, is simply, why? Why would anyone willingly step into this nightmare, this existence that is little more than a slow walk towards a gruesome end? Let's face it, plague body collector probably wasn't on your list of dream jobs when you were younger. Right up there with dragon dental hygienist or professional anvil catcher. The truth for almost everyone who trudges this path is that there was no real choice at all. It wasn't a career fair or a carefully considered life decision that brought you here. It was desperation, pure and absolute. Imagine your children, their bellies swollen with hunger, their cries weakening by the day. Imagine the gnawing emptiness in your own stomach, the dizzy spells, the knowledge that without food you'll simply fade away. Or perhaps you weren't starving, not yet, but you were already on the fringes, accused of a crime rightly or wrongly, and languishing in a filthy, overcrowded jail where the plague was already running rampant. The offer comes, take up the cart, and bell collect the dead, and maybe you'll earn your freedom, or at least a stay of execution. It's a devil's bargain, trading one near certain death for another slightly less certain one with a sliver of a chance for survival, however slim. For many, the alternative to collecting the plague dead was simply becoming one of them through starvation disease in prison or the executioner's hand. The pool of recruits for this most undesirable of tasks was drawn from the deepest wells of human misery. If you were a slave or an indentured servant, your master, terrified of the contagion himself, might simply order you to do it. Your life was not your own. Your body was his property, to be risked as he saw fit. Then there were the prisoners, as mentioned. Jailers eager to empty their festering institutions and protect their own skins would readily offer up their charges for such hazardous duty. A pardon if you survived a season. For someone facing the gallows or a lifetime in chains, it might have seemed like the only straw to clutch at. And of course, there were the desperately poor, those who had lost everything, their livelihoods, their homes, their families, to the relentless march of the pestilence or the societal collapse that followed in its wake, with no craft to ply, no fields to, till as the Black Death caused massive labor shortages after its peak. But during the chaos, many were simply displaced and unemployed, and no charity to be found. The offer of even a meager wage or a crust of bread in exchange for this work could seem like the only option left. And what of this payment? The employee benefits package was unique. Included high chance of immediate demise, universal social avoidance, and all the corpse air you could breathe. No dental plan, though. If you were lucky, you might receive a daily ration of food. Coarse bread, perhaps some thin soup, or a few scraps of withered vegetable. Just enough to keep you on your feet, to fuel your grim labors for another day. Sometimes, the payment was even more macabre: permission to take clothing or other small portable items from the dead. This was a perilous reward. Not only did it increase your risk of infection from contaminated articles, but it also solidified your reputation as a ghoul, a looter of the dead, further alienating you from any shred of human compassion. Imagine wearing a dead man's shoes not out of choice, but because they were your only payment for carrying him to his final undignified resting place. Shelter might be part of the deal too. Usually, a squalid abandoned hovel that no one else dared inhabit, a place already thick with the ghosts of previous victims. As for coin, that was rare. Money had less value when the fabric of society was unraveling, and those in charge were more likely to part with perishable goods or tainted belongings than hard currency. So you weigh it up in your mind if you even have the strength for such calculations. On one side, the certainty of a slow, agonizing death from starvation, or the brutality of an executioner's axe, or the festering misery of a plague-ridden jail. On the other, the high probability of a swift, agonizing death from the plague, but with it, the slimmest chance of food in your belly tonight, a roof over your head, or even for the condemned a future. It's a grim barter. As for your salary, don't expect a direct deposit. It's more of a, here's a turnip and try not to die before dinner kind of arrangement. Performance bonuses were probably just surviving another day. It's worth noting as a quirky contrast that in some Italian cities, lay religious brotherhoods, known as confraternities, sometimes took on the task of burying the destitute dead as an act of Christian charity. Their motivations were rooted in faith and a sense of duty, not direct payment or coercion, though the risks were just as real. However, the sheer scale of the Black Death meant that such charitable efforts, noble as they were often overwhelmed, and the bulk of the body collection fell to those who had no other recourse. Scholars continue to examine recruitment methods for plague workers across different European localities, debating the balance between coercive measures, economic incentives, however meager or grim, and offers of legal pardon or manumission. But for you, the individual with the cart handle greasy in your grip, academic debates matter little. Your choice was made in the shadow of the gallows or in the face of your child's hunger, and it's a choice that leads you day after day into the very heart of death. You've made your grim bargain. You've shouldered the burden of your unwanted profession, and you navigate the desolate streets, a pariah guided by the creak of your cart, and the clang of your bell. But now, another layer of this nightmare begins to unfold, one that strikes at the very heart of what little order and solace remains in this shattered world. It concerns the final act, the disposition of the dead you so diligently collect. For the people of this 14th century European landscape burial isn't just a practical matter of hygiene, it's a sacred rite, a profound spiritual necessity. To be interred in consecrated ground within the hallowed confines of the churchyard under the watchful eye of God and amidst the prayers of the faithful is paramount. It's seen as crucial for the soul's journey into the afterlife, for the promise of resurrection. This deeply ingrained belief is now facing a crisis of unprecedented proportions, and you, dear collector, are on the front lines witnessing its collapse. With each passing day, as your cart groans under its ever-increasing load, you make your weary way to the local churchyard. In the before times, this would have been a place of somber peace, of grassy mounds, and perhaps a few weathered stone markers, a place for quiet contemplation. Now it's a scene of frantic, desperate activity, or worse, exhausted, overwhelmed stillness. The grave diggers, those who haven't succumbed themselves or fled in terror, are gaunt figures, their movements mechanical, their faces smudged with dirt and despair. The churchyards started looking less like peaceful resting places and more like very poorly organized, very permanent outdoor festivals. Except, with more death and less music. The ground is churned up a muddy morass of freshly turned earth and shallow depressions. Space is visibly, alarmingly shrinking. What were once neat rows of graves have become a chaotic jumble bodies, interred with terrifying haste, sometimes only inches apart. You see it happening. First, the individual graves become shallower dug with less care. Then they start digging wider trenches, communal resting places for those who died on the same day. But even these quickly fill. The sheer, unrelenting volume of the dead is like a tidal wave, swamping every effort to maintain traditional decencies. The mainstream historical fact is that in many cities, authorities desperately tried to address this. In places like London, new plague cemeteries were hastily consecrated and opened. For instance, land was purchased by figures like Sir Walter de Manny in 1349 near Smithfield, specifically for plague burials, a plot that would eventually become the final resting place for tens of thousands. Similar emergency measures were taken in other major urban centers across Europe. But even these expansions, these new plague fields, were often not enough, or they filled with horrifying rapidity. The death toll simply outpaced every conceivable measure. And then the day comes, a day you've perhaps dreaded more than any other. You arrive with your laden cart at the church gates, and the priest, his face a mask of anguish and exhaustion, holds up a hand. No more, he might say, his voice cracking. There's no more room. We cannot take them. The sacred ground is full, utterly, completely full. The church, the very institution that is supposed to offer solace and see to the spiritual needs of its flock from cradle to grave, is now quite literally turning away the dead. Eventually, the cemeteries basically had to hang up a no vacancy sign. Sorry folks, we're full up. Try again next apocalypse. Not very comforting for your eternal rest. This isn't just a logistical problem. It's a profound spiritual crisis. For the surviving populace, this is a new dimension of horror. If the church, God's representative on earth, cannot even provide a sanctified patch of earth for their loved ones or for themselves, When their time comes, then what hope is left? What becomes of the soul denied its rightful resting place? The fear is palpable. This desperation led to some rather quirky and heartbreaking behaviors. There are accounts from the period of people attempting to bury their family members secretly within church grounds under the cover of darkness, or trying to bribe beleaguered priests or sextons to find just one last spot. Some, if they had the means, even tried to have their dead interred within the church building itself, a privilege usually reserved for the very wealthy or clergy. In the frantic scramble for sacred soil, existing graves were sometimes reopened, their long-term occupants unceremoniously removed or simply buried deeper to make way for the newly dead, a grim form of subleasing your eternal plot. The sanctity of the grave, a cornerstone of their worldview, was being violated on a massive scale. So the church gates are closed to your grim cargo. The local priest, who used to be all about ashes to ashes, dust to dust, is now probably looking at your cart like it's carrying an undeclared tax audit directly from the underworld. His stress levels are, shall we say, biblically high. The bodies in your cart, collected with such peril and effort, are now in a terrifying limbo. They cannot stay with the living, yet the traditional havens of the dead are barred. Historians debate the speed and uniformity with which different ecclesiastical authorities across Europe acknowledge this burial crisis and authorized or simply resigned themselves to alternatives to traditional individual interment in consecrated ground. Some were undoubtedly pragmatic, forced by the sheer scale of mortality to find new solutions quickly. Others may have clung to tradition and doctrine for as long as humanly possible, perhaps inadvertently worsening the public health situation by delaying the inevitable. For you, the collector, the immediate problem is acute. Your cart is full, the day is wearing on, and the dead have nowhere to go. This crushing reality, this failure of the most sacred traditions, paves the way for an even grimmer solution, a testament to humanity's desperate improvisation in the face of overwhelming catastrophe. The church gates have slammed shut on your grim cargo, a symbolic and terrifyingly literal end to centuries of tradition. The question of where the dead now go hangs heavier in the air than the stench of decay itself. You with your cart, laden with those who have succumbed, are left in a horrifying limbo. But the bodies can't just stay on the cart, can they? The living, however few and however terrified, cannot coexist with streets lined with the unburied dead. And so, a new directive, born of sheer, unadulterated desperation, begins to filter down through the fractured channels of whatever civic or religious authority still functions. You're no longer heading towards the hallowed ground of the church. You're being pointed towards something else, something new and dreadful, the pits. Your new destination is often a place beyond the city walls, or in a desolate, forgotten patch of land that no one would have ever considered for a final resting place in ordinary times. So, with the churchyards having a no-vacancy crisis, city planners, or perhaps just panicked aldermen, had to get creative with new housing developments for the deceased. Prime locations, usually somewhere a bit out of town with, shall we say, permanently quiet neighbors. The journey itself feels different. You're leaving the familiar, if now terrifying confines of the town, moving into areas that might have once been fields, or common land, or simply wasteland. There's a chilling symbolism to this. Those who died from the pestilence are now, even in death, being physically removed, cast out from the community of the living, and from the sanctity of consecrated ground. It's another layer of exclusion, a final bleak banishment. And then you see it. The term plague pit does little to prepare you for the reality. It's not a grave in any sense you'd recognize. It is quite literally a giant hole, a vast open wound gouged into the earth. Imagine a trench, but deeper, wider, longer than anything you'd think possible to dig by hand, especially with a depleted and terrified workforce. The raw earth is piled high around its edges, a testament to the frantic, hurried labor that brought it into existence. These pits weren't exactly handcrafted, artisanal graves. More like the earth had developed a sudden, insatiable appetite, and workers were just trying to keep its maw fed. Dig faster, the customers are arriving. The sheer scale is breathtaking in the most awful way. Giovanni Boccaccio, in his harrowing account of the plague in Florence in 1348, described how when churchyards filled enormous trenches were excavated, into these the dead were laid in layers like goods in a ship's hold. He wrote, or perhaps more chillingly, like layers of lasagna, each tier of bodies covered with a thin scattering of earth before the next was piled on top. This was the stark, unvarnished reality. The pit waits an enormous empty maw, ready to swallow the dead wholesale. This is a far cry from the quiet dignity, however modest, of a churchyard burial. There are no individual plots here, no neatly defined spaces for quiet reflection or mourning. There will be no headstones, no carved names, no lovingly planted flowers. This is not a garden of remembrance. It is a void, a chasm of anonymity. The air around it is heavy, not just with the smell of disturbed earth, but with an almost palpable sense of despair. You might see other collectors arriving their carts, equally laden, their faces grim. The workers who dug the pit, if they are still there, move with a grim, exhausted efficiency, their expressions unreadable. Occasionally, these mass graves had to be dug in even more confronting locations. It's a quirky and horrifying tidbit that if a city was under siege, or if land outside was simply unavailable, or too dangerous to reach, these pits were sometimes dug in what were formerly public spaces within the city walls. A marketplace suddenly silent, and requisitioned a public garden turned into a charnel ground. Imagine walking past that every day, an open scar in the heart of your community constantly being filled. This, then, is the solution to the overwhelming crisis of mortality. It's a solution born not of choice, but of grim necessity. The sheer number of bodies, the speed at which they accumulated, and the fear of further contagion left authorities with few, if any, other options. The careful rituals, the prayers, the individual attention that death once commanded, all of it has been stripped away. Human life, in its final moments and beyond, is reduced to a problem of logistics of disposal. Archaeologists and historians continue to debate the exact processes and labor organization involved in the creation and use of plague pits in various locations. Were they typically dug incrementally, expanding as needed day by day? Or were some of these massive excavations undertaken in a single desperate effort in grim anticipation of the overwhelming numbers yet to come? The evidence varies, but the outcome was largely the same: an undignified, anonymous end for countless thousands. The new burial sites weren't going to win any Cemetery of the Year awards. Less peaceful, eternal slumber, and more, well, that's one way to clear a backlog. The ambiance was decidedly earthy and profoundly sorrowful. As you guide your cart towards the edge of this yawning chasm, you know that this is where your burdens will now be deposited into the dark, silent earth that has become death's insatiable new domain. You've maneuvered your creaking cart to the very lip of the chasm, this yawning mouth in the earth, that has become the city's new, unwelcome cemetery. The air here is thick with the smell of freshly turned soil, damp and heavy, and perhaps a faint underlying sweetness of decay that the wind hasn't yet carried away. Other carts are arriving or leaving empty their drivers, ashen-faced and silent. Below you, the pit is already pocked with the still forms of those who arrived before your current load. There's no order to it, no neat rows, just a scattering of human shapes in the gray light, a prelude to the grim task at hand. Your arms ache, your back screams in protest, but there's no time for rest. The living and the dead are waiting. The process of unloading is brutally, starkly functional. There are no priests here to offer final prayers, no grieving families to cast a symbolic handful of earth. This isn't a one-at-a-time with feeling kind of operation, more like quantity over quality for eternal rest. Efficiency was the grim watchword of the day. You, and perhaps another collector, if you're lucky enough to have a partner, will take hold of a body often stiff and unyielding, and with a practiced weary heave, consign it to the depths. Sometimes, the bodies are tipped directly from the cart if it can be angled precariously enough over the edge, tumbling in a grotesque parody of a child's doll. The sound they make landing is a dull, soft thud quickly absorbed by the earth or by the bodies already there. There's no ceremony, no reverence, just a relentless effort to clear the cart and make way for the next load that is inevitably already accumulating back in the desolate streets. Often these souls are stripped of more than just their lives. Coffins. An unimaginable luxury reserved for the very first victims, perhaps before the scale of the disaster truly hit. Even proper shrouds become scarce. The rough cloth you might have used to cover a face or a body in the cart is often reclaimed needed for the next victim. Clothing, too, might have been taken, either by desperate family members with nothing left or by other collectors as that grim form of payment we discussed. So many are tipped into these pits with nothing to cover their nakedness, their final vestiges of earthly dignity gone. The Sienese chronicler, Agnolo di Tura, who lived through the Black Death, wrote with heartbreaking directness. And in many places in Siena, great pits were dug and piled deep with a multitude of dead. And I, Agnolo di Tura, called the Fat, buried my 5 children with my own hands. His words paint a vivid personal picture of this mass disposal, a father forced to become the gravedigger for his own offspring, a task that underscores the utter collapse of normal human ritual. Each body that tumbles into the pit is a story, lost a name, unspoken, an identity dissolving into the anonymous mass. The most chilling sights, perhaps, are when you recognize that you are handling not just individuals, but the remnants of entire families. A mother still curled around a child, a husband and wife found together in their deathbed, now tumbling into the pit, their earthly bonds unbroken, but their shared fate horrific. Children, small and heartbreakingly light, are tossed in alongside their parents, their grandparents. Whole households, extinguished in a matter of days, now find their final communal resting place here. Well, at least families got to stick together, though probably not the kind of quality time anyone had envisioned for their eternal repose. Group rates, perhaps, but not in a good way. The plague was no respecter of age or status, and the pits reflect this grim egalitarianism. Lineages that might have stretched back for generations end here unceremoniously in a tangled heap of anonymous humanity. And so the layers build. Just as Boccaccio described in Florence, your load is added to the others, and soon a thin layer of soil might be hastily shoveled over them by designated pit workers, if any are available and willing. Then the next wave of carts arrives and the process repeats. Bodies upon bodies separated by mere inches of dirt, or sometimes not even that. There are some incredibly grim, though not always verifiable accounts from the period suggesting that in some pits, to make space, as it were, workers were tasked with treading down the bodies to compress them, ensuring more could fit. Whether this was widespread or an isolated horror, the very idea speaks to the utter desperation and dehumanization that occurred. Bioarchaeologists today, when excavating these historical plague pits, can sometimes discern these layers, noting how bodies are positioned, whether they were interred with any care at all or simply dumped. These findings lead to ongoing scholarly discussions about the precise speed and methods of deposition. Were the pits filled with frantic haste over a few terrible days, or was it a more drawn-out process spanning weeks as the pestilence ebbed and flowed? As for names and records, lost in the paperwork would be an understatement. The paperwork was probably also in the pit. It was a very thorough approach to data deletion. For those within their individual stories, their joys, their sorrows, their very names are lost to the earth, absorbed into the collective tragedy. This is the silent, undignified end for so many a layer cake of loss in the grim maw of the earth. The layers of the dead accumulate in the vast open pits, a silent testament to the plague's relentless hunger. Each body you tip over the edge is, you hope at peace, its suffering ended. But a new insidious fear begins to creep into your already overburdened mind, a horror perhaps even more chilling than the disease itself, the dread of premature burial. In an age before stethoscopes, before EKGs, before the medical understanding of comas or deep shock states, determining with absolute certainty that someone had truly passed from life was, let's just say, not an exact science. Checking for vital signs was a bit rudimentary. Is he groaning? No good enough in the cart, he goes. Not exactly a thorough medical examination by today's standards, especially when the patient might be exhibiting symptoms like extreme lethargy or a death-like stillness brought on by the ravages of the pestilence. Imagine yourself on your rounds. The light is fading, or perhaps it's the dead of night, the only illumination a flickering torch, casting long dancing shadows. You reach for a body in a darkened room, stiff and cold to the touch. But as you lift it, do you hear a faint sigh, a barely perceptible flutter of an eyelid? Or even more unnervingly, once the body is on the cart piled amongst others, do you hear a muffled groan from beneath the heap as the cart jolts over the uneven cobblestones? Your blood would turn to ice. In the overwhelming haste and terror of your daily work, driven by the need to clear houses quickly and move on, how much time do you or any collector really spend ensuring that each soul is truly and irrevocably departed? The answer is likely not enough. The priority is speed driven by fear of contagion and the sheer volume of work. A still body, especially one ravaged by plague, is presumed dead. And that presumption could have unimaginably horrific consequences. This oops factor, as the prompt rather cheekily puts it, is the stuff of nightmares. At the edge of the plague pit, as bodies are unceremoniously tumbled in, the chaos is immense. There's no careful laying out, no final check. What if someone deep in a plague-induced coma, mistaken for dead, was jolted back to a sliver of consciousness by the rough handling, only to find themselves at the bottom of a dark earthen chasm? with the weight of other bodies pressing down. The historical fact is that taphophobia, the fear of being buried alive, was a very real and potent anxiety throughout history, and it was undoubtedly exacerbated to terrifying new heights during periods of mass death like the Black Death. The rapid, impersonal disposal of bodies, often in darkness and with minimal oversight, created the perfect conditions for such an error to occur. While specific, verifiable accounts of individuals surviving premature burial in a Black Death pit are exceptionally rare, as one might imagine the survival odds would be practically nil, the fear and the possibility were pervasive. Think for a moment of that ultimate horror. To awaken not in your bed, but in the back of a jolting cart, surrounded by the cold, still forms of the dead. The stench, the oppressive darkness, the dawning, sickening realization of where you are and where you are heading. Imagine waking up in the back of that cart. "Excuse me, driver. I think I got on the wrong existential bus. This wasn't my stop." Talk about a rude awakening. Or worse, to regain some level of awareness already in the pit, the weight of earth and other bodies, pressing down the sounds of more being added above you, the suffocating darkness, the utter complete hopelessness. It's a terror that transcends words. It's no wonder that in later centuries, as a quirky tidbit, reflecting this deep-seated fear, some people's wills included specific instructions for before their burial requests for a waiting period for a doctor to perform a definitive test, like lancing the heart or holding a mirror to the lips, all to prevent the unspeakable. During the Black Death, however, such luxuries of time, such careful considerations were almost invariably swept away by the tide of mortality. For you, the body collector, this possibility becomes another ghost to haunt your waking hours and your troubled sleep. Did that last one move? Was that a breath or just the wind? Every so often, you might think you hear something from the pit after you've emptied your cart. A sound that could be the settling of the earth or something else. The thought that you might have been the one to consign a still-breathing person to that earth and hell is a burden almost too great to bear, even amidst all the other horrors. You probably wouldn't get many complaints if you accidentally collected someone still clinging to life. Mostly because they'd be, at the bottom of a pit. Customer service was a bit one-sided in this particular industry. While historians and archaeologists debate the actual frequency of such events, was it a common occurrence or a rare but terrifying accident magnified by fear and folklore? The undeniable pressures for rapid corpse disposal made it a chillingly real possibility. The line between deep unconsciousness and death was a blurry one, and in the chaotic haste of the plague, it was a line that could with devastating consequences be crossed. This unspeakable horror adds yet another layer of torment to your already grim existence, a whisper of doubt that follows every body you collect. As you navigate this world of premature burials and overflowing plague pits, a constant gnawing question for those who live through it, and for you in this reimagined nightmare, was why. Why was this happening? What unseen force, what malevolent entity was responsible for such widespread, indiscriminate suffering? Learned scholars and terrified peasants alike grasped at explanations. Many pointed to a corruption of the air, the miasma we've spoken of, a poisonous fog emanating from the earth or sent down from the heavens. Others saw it as divine retribution, the wrath of God unleashed upon a sinful world calling for fervent prayer and desperate acts of penance. Some even looked to the stars, blaming unfavorable alignments of the planets. Back then, their understanding of disease transmission was a bit like trying to assemble IKEA furniture in the dark with instructions written in ancient hieroglyphics. Lots of theories, not many of them helpful. Little did anyone suspect that the true culprits, the shadowy architects of this immense tragedy, were far smaller, far more numerous, and operating almost entirely beneath notice, scuttling in the very fabric of their daily lives. You see them everywhere, of course. Rats. They are an undeniable, unavoidable part of the 14th century urban landscape, as common as cobblestones and complaining neighbors, though the neighbors are quieter these days. In your grim work as a body collector, you encounter them constantly. They dart from beneath piles of refuse as your cart rumbles past their claws, scrabbling on the stone. You see their sleek dark forms disappearing into the shadows of deserted houses you're forced to enter. Sometimes their bold, beady eyes seem to watch you from the rafters of a plague-emptied home as you go about your sorrowful task. Before the plague, they were a nuisance, a pest, a minor irritation of daily life. Now, with so many homes suddenly vacant, so much food left untended, their populations are likely booming. They are, in a grim way, beneficiaries of humanity's decline. But it wasn't the rats themselves, not directly, that unleashed this torrent of death. They were merely the unwilling, unwitting chauffeurs for an even tinier, more insidious passenger, the flea. Specifically, species like Xenocilla chiopus, the oriental rat flea, are often implicated as the primary vector. These minuscule bloodsuckers would infest the rats, and when a rat died, often from the plague itself, as they too are susceptible, the fleas would seek a new warm host. In a world where humans lived in close proximity to rats, that new host was all too often a person. And carried within these fleas, multiplying in their guts until it choked them and was regurgitated with every bite, was the true villain of our story, a microscopic bacterium called Yersinia pestis. It was only centuries later, in 1894, that Alexandre Yersin identified this bacterium, and shortly after Paul-Louis Simon established the crucial role of rat fleas in transmitting the plague. More than 500 years after you and your contemporaries suffered its ravages, the real enemy finally had a name and a known method of attack. Imagine the tragic irony. While people were busy burning incense to purify the air, flagellating themselves to appease an angry god, or suspiciously eyeing their neighbors, the actual agents of their destruction were hopping from rat to human-injecting death with every bite completely unheeded. The rats, meanwhile, were having a field day. Plenty of food, with society disrupted, fewer humans actively trying to exterminate them. It was like a rodent utopia if your idea of utopia involves a lot of plague and widespread suffering for other species. They scurried through the straw on the floors of cottages nested in the thatched roofs, navigated the overflowing sewers and rubbish heaps, each one a potential mobile reservoir of death, carrying its deadly microscopic cargo into every corner of human life. Efforts to control the plague by killing cats and dogs, which happened in some places due to mistaken beliefs about them spreading disease, likely only made the rat problem worse, a tragic example of good intentions leading to disastrous consequences. So these rats, and their even more invisible passengers, become silent, almost indifferent witnesses to the unfolding human catastrophe. You might see them perched on the edge of a plague pit, their noses twitching before disappearing back into the shadows. Perhaps a particularly bold one will scurry across your path as you leave a house where you've just collected a whole family. While people in the 14th century didn't connect rats directly to the plague's transmission, certain animals were sometimes generally associated with uncleanliness or seen as ill omens in medieval folklore and bestiaries, though the sheer commonness of rats often relegated them to mere background pests. And the fleas, the real MVPs of misery, so small, so discreet, they were the ninjas of the pathogenic world, delivering their deadly payload without anyone even knowing they were there. It's worth noting that while the rat-flea-human model is the most widely accepted explanation for bubonic plague, some researchers continue to explore other possibilities, such as the potential role of human ectoparasites, like human fleas and lice in secondary spread, or whether other animal reservoirs might have helped maintain the disease in the environment between major outbreaks. But for the purposes of our grim journey, these shadowy scuttling figures and their tiny bloodthirsty companions are the unseen engine driving the death cart you so wearily pull. They are the true, if unrecognized, reapers of this devastating harvest. So you now understand with a clarity that chills you far more than any miasma theory ever could, that these small, scuttling creatures, the rats and their even smaller unseen passengers, the fleas, are the true conduits of this unimaginable suffering. But this knowledge, a grim enlightenment from a future you cannot comprehend, doesn't change your present reality. It only casts a more sinister light on what you observe every single day, a world utterly overrun by these furry little agents of doom, a veritable rodent rain. They are everywhere, their presence a constant gnawing reminder of humanity's failing grip on a world turned upside down. You see them in the crumbling, plague-emptied houses you're forced to enter. They rustle in the moldy straw, bedding their shadows darting across walls where families once lived and laughed. Sometimes you'll find them helping themselves to a forgotten crust of bread on a table, or a spilled sack of grain in a merchant's abandoned shop. With so many humans checking out permanently, the rats were experiencing a property boom. 3-bedroom hovel, recently vacated, lovely plaguey aroma, yours for a nibble. They scurry through the deserted market stalls, their boldness growing with each passing day. The once bustling streets, now eerily silent, save for your own grim passage, are their new highways. Even the churches, once sanctuaries, are not immune. You might see a rat dart across the cold stone floor of a nave, its tiny claws clicking in the vast echoing emptiness, a profound desecration of sacred space. Their sounds become a constant unsettling soundtrack to your existence. The scratching in the walls, the sudden skittering in the periphery of your vision, the soft patter of their feet in the darkness. What's perhaps most unsettling is their newfound fearlessness. Before the plague, rats were wary creatures quick to flee at the sight or sound of a human. They were creatures of the night, of the hidden spaces. Now it's as if they sense the shift in power. With so many humans dead, dying, or simply too weak and terrified to pose a threat, the rats have grown bold. They might pause and look at you, their beady eyes reflecting the dim light before casually continuing on their way. The rats stopped even pretending to be scared of you. It was less, "Oh no, a human," and more, "Oh, it's just you again. Don't mind me just ransacking this. Well, everything. You want some?" This brazenness is a deeply disturbing sign of how far things have fallen. Chronicles and ecclesiastical records from the Black Death era often describe the profound desolation of towns and cities, the eerie quiet that settled over once thriving communities. This dramatic alteration of the human environment would inevitably have impacted animal behavior, allowing creatures like rats to become more visible and audacious as the dominant species humanity faltered. And then there's their presence at the plague pits. As you approach these vast open maws in the earth, ready to add your grim load, you notice them. They are not just passing by. They are drawn here to these sites of mass human disposal. You see them lurking around the edges, darting in and out of the shadows cast by the piles of disturbed earth. The implication, too horrific to dwell on, but impossible to ignore, is that they are scavenging. The sheer volume of death provides an unimaginable, grotesque feast. While your task is to bring out the dead, theirs, it seems, is to pick over the remnants. This doesn't need to be graphically described for you to feel the cold knot of revulsion in your stomach. The sight of these creatures thriving amidst such profound human tragedy, feasting with impunity where prayers have fallen silent, is a particularly bitter pill to swallow. Its nature red, in tooth and claw, yes, but it feels like a personal insult, a final mockery of human dignity. This rodent impunity, this kingdom of the rat emerging from the ruins of human society, has a profound psychological impact on any who are left to witness it. It's another sign that the world has been fundamentally broken, that the natural order has been hideously inverted. While there were certainly rat catchers in the medieval period, professionals often accompanied by specially trained dogs like terriers, their efforts even in normal times were a constant battle. During the Black Death, any such measures would have been laughably, tragically inadequate, and the rat catchers themselves would have been at extreme risk. Their profession would have seen a grim sort of boom, quickly followed by an even grimmer personal bust for many. Ecologists and historians sometimes discuss the complex plague dynamics that involve rodent populations. Did the plague cause massive die-offs among the rats too, forcing infected fleas to seek human hosts more aggressively? Or did surviving, perhaps more plague-resistant rat populations then thrive and expand in the drastically altered environment with fewer predators and an abundance of resources? These are questions debated by scholars. For you, the observer on the ground, the simple, awful truth is that the rats are flourishing as humanity withers. Their Yelp reviews for the local plague pits, if they could write them, might read, ample servings, if a bit monotonous. Atmosphere a little dead. 3 stars. A world where rats feast without fear while humans are dragged to anonymous graves is a world teetering on the edge of utter despair. The rats are not just a teeming physical presence in this devastated world. Their shadow has stretched and darkened in your mind and in the collective consciousness of the few who remain. They are no longer simply vermin, a background nuisance of medieval life. Their constant brazen association with sickness, with the dying, and with the unceremonious dead has begun to transform them into something far more sinister, a symbol, an omen, a furry little embodiment of the plague itself. The rats weren't exactly winning any popularity contests before, but during the plague, their public image really took a nosedive. They became the unofficial, unwelcome mascots of misery. Everywhere you look, their presence is intertwined with death. You see them darting from houses where you know the pestilence has struck their sleek bodies, disappearing into the gloom, as if they are fleeing the scene of a crime they somehow orchestrated. You hear their scuttling in the walls of rooms, where families lie in their final agonized throes. This constant proximity breeds a chilling association. A glimpse of a rat flashing across a path is no longer a minor annoyance that might make you jump. It's a cold spike of fear, a whisper in your soul that death is near, that this particular street or house is tainted marked. They become portents of doom. Forget pest. Their new job title in the popular imagination was something like Junior Grim Reaper Rodent Division. Or maybe Death's Little Helpers. Their connection to your grim trade as a body collector further solidifies this terrifying symbolism. As you make your rounds with the creaking cart, they are your silent, unwelcome companions. You might see a rat perched momentarily on the edge of your cart when you pause its beady eyes, seeming to survey your grim cargo with an unnerving intelligence before it vanishes. Or worse, as you approach a house to collect the dead, you might see them scattering from within their task of scavenging, momentarily interrupted by your arrival. This constant attendance upon the dead, this tireless activity around the sites of human suffering, transforms them from mere animals into what feels like death's attendants, its unwitting. Or so you hope heralds. While the primary artistic personification of death in this era found in the widespread danse macabre, or dance of death imagery, was typically a grinning skeleton leading all walks of life to the grave, the general atmosphere of decay ruin, and the noticeable presence of vermin certainly contributed to the overwhelming memento mori. Remember, you must die. Theme that permeated the art and thought of the time. Rats in this context become part of death's grim entourage. The most horrifying aspect of their new symbolic role comes from their direct interaction with the dead or the fear of it. You, as a collector, might try to shield your mind from such thoughts, but they intrude nonetheless. The prompt mentioned rats chewing on faces. And while we won't dwell on graphic descriptions, the fear of such a thing would have been a potent psychological torment. In a world where bodies might lie uncollected for a time, or where they are simply piled in open pits, the thought of these creatures driven by hunger, disrespecting the dead in such a primal way, is an ultimate violation. Perhaps you see them near the faces of the recently deceased with an unsettling focus, or hear whispered terrified tales from other survivors of what rats have been seen doing. Even without witnessing the worst, the mere possibility their known tendency to scavenge paints them as defilers, as creatures that feast upon human sorrow. A rat seen near a corpse is no longer just a rat. It's a furry reaper, claiming its due, erasing the last vestiges of human dignity. This potent symbolism adds another layer of dread to an already unbearable existence. Seeing a rat suddenly became less "eek a rat" and more, "well, it was nice knowing you all. Dibs on my meager possessions if I'm next." They were the furry little fortune cookies of doom. Locally specific superstitions might have easily sprung up or intensified. Perhaps an unusual swarm of rats seen in a particular district was taken as a definitive sign that the plague would strike there next with renewed fury. A rat crossing your path might be seen as a far more dire omen than any broken mirror. It's a quirky tidbit of human psychology that in times of overwhelming, inexplicable crisis, we seek patterns, we create meaning, even if that meaning is terrifying. Art historians and cultural historians continue to analyze the extent to which rats were explicitly and widely used as iconographic symbols of the plague in contemporary 14th century visual culture, versus their more generalized association with decay, or whether their truly prominent symbolic role as the plague carrier became more solidified in later artistic retrospections, once the science was better understood. But for you, living it, the association is visceral, immediate, and undeniable. These creatures, once just a part of the city's ecosystem, now represent the world's decay, the triumph of chaos, and the chilling indifference of nature to human suffering. They are the final grim flourish in a landscape utterly dominated by death. The journey through the desolate streets of the 14th century in shoes no one would ever willingly fill is drawing to a close. You, the unwilling collector, have witnessed humanity brought to its knees, traditions shattered, and the very earth transformed into a hungry maw. The rats, those furry little reapers, have played their part, becoming potent symbols of an age of terror. But what of the aftermath? When the last card is emptied, when the acute phase of the pestilence finally mercifully begins to recede, what legacy remains from this time of unparalleled horror? The scars, as you can imagine, run deep, not just in the minds of the survivors, but in the very soil beneath their feet. Centuries pass. Cities heal, grow, and modernize. Wooden hovels give way to stone buildings, then to steel and glass skyscrapers. But the earth remembers. One of the most chilling ways the Black Death still touches our modern world is through the accidental uncovering of these forgotten plague pits. Modern city planners occasionally get a real surprise when digging foundations for a new office block, a subway line, or a trendy cafe. Is that a historically significant mass grave filled with hundreds, if not thousands of skeletons? Oops, there goes our schedule and budget. Suddenly, the relentless march of progress halts, and a tangible link to the 14th century's nightmare is exposed. Archaeological teams are called in, and the site becomes a window into that calamitous past. Places like East Smithfield in London, one of the first cemeteries specifically consecrated for plague victims in 1348, have been meticulously excavated. These digs provide invaluable, if somber, information, not just about burial practices during a crisis, but about the people themselves. Their age at death, their health prior to the plague, sometimes even hints of their diet or origin through isotopic analysis of their bones. Its history raw and unfiltered, literally dug up from the ground. It's a profound and unsettling thought, isn't it? That beneath the bustling streets of many of Europe's oldest cities beneath the pavement you might walk on today, lie these layers of history, some of them far more densely populated with the departed than others. Untold numbers of these mass graves likely remain undiscovered, their locations lost to time, their occupants sleeping anonymously just a few feet below the thrum of modern life. Sometimes during these excavations, amidst the jumble of bones, archaeologists find poignant little traces of the lives, cut short, a simple bronze ring, still on a finger bone, a corroded belt buckle, a handful of forgotten coins that could offer no bribe against death. These small personal items, often displayed in museums, bridge the centuries with an almost unbearable intimacy, reminding us that these were not just statistics, but individuals, each with a life, hopes, and fears swept away in a tide of disease. They are the echoes from below, a grim testament to a time when death became overwhelmingly, terrifyingly routine. The Black Death didn't just leave physical scars. It irrevocably altered the course of European society. The massive depopulation led to labor shortages, which in a complex ripple effect contributed to the decline of feudalism and the rise of a more mobile workforce able to demand better wages and conditions. It spurred innovation in some areas as people sought new ways to cope with a changed world. The psychological impact was immense, fostering a morbid preoccupation with death evident in art and literature, but also perhaps a renewed appreciation for life among those who survived. The extent to which the Black Death directly triggered the Renaissance is a complex subject of debate among historians, with some arguing its profound societal disruption created fertile ground for new ways of thinking and artistic expression, while others emphasize more gradual pre-existing trends that were merely accelerated by the crisis. Regardless of the precise calculus of its influence, the fear of plague, the great mortality, lingered for centuries, with subsequent outbreaks continuing to terrorize populations until well into the early modern period. The rats, those unintentional agents of such profound change, have faded from their symbolic role as harbingers of divine wrath, or furry grim reapers in our modern scientific understanding. We know their part in the chain of infection, and we have, for the most part, better sanitation and pest control, though they remain a persistent feature of urban life. So the next time you complain about a rat in the subway, just remember, it could be worse. It could be a 14th century rat with a much more ominous agenda and significantly worse personal hygiene. So next time you see a rat in your kitchen, just be glad it doesn't come with a Bella cart and a request for your body. Now, as the echoes of that distant, dreadful bell finally begin to fade, and the image of the burdened cart recedes into the mists of time, allow your mind to gently float back from those shadowy 14th century streets. The weight of that era, the pervasive sense of fear and loss, can begin to lift like a heavy cloak slipping from your shoulders. You are here now, in the quiet comfort of your own space, far removed from the desperate choices and the unceasing sorrow of the plague years. The air you breathe is clear, and the ground beneath you holds no such immediate sorrowful secrets. Let the darkness around you be a soft blanket, a comforting embrace rather than a shroud of fear. The stories of the past, even the darkest ones, serve to remind us of the resilience of the human spirit, the enduring capacity to survive, to rebuild, and to remember even in the face of overwhelming adversity. The quiet hum of your fan, or the gentle stillness of your room, can now draw you further away from the clang of that mournful bell, further away from the creak of those burdened wheels. Picture instead a peaceful, starlit sky, vast and serene, a timeless canvas far above the troubles of any single age. Feel a sense of calm settle over you, a gentle release from the vivid imagery of our journey tonight. The path was grim, the shadows deep, but you walked it only in thought, and now you can leave those shadows behind. Allow your breathing to deepen slowly and evenly as you drift towards a truly restful sleep, carrying with you only the quiet peace of the present moment and the softest, most gentle dreams. Sweet dreams.